Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. Deputy Minister, ladies and gentlemen, very good to be here among you. I was looking at the title of the conference and I thought I had my business card was a mouthful, but certainly you've achieved something bigger. The title of this conference is bigger than all of us, a grand strategy for a two-state solution. Certainly that is a mouthful. I'm sure in Hebrew it sounds longer. I'm here today and I hold the unenviable task to represent the United Nations in what is known as the Middle East peace process at a time when there is neither a peace process nor there is peace in the Middle East. And I start with that always because it is pretty much left in the circumstances that we are in to people like myself to design the role that the United Nations can play in supporting the efforts of supporting the efforts of people here on the ground to achieve a just and lasting solution to what has been a conflict that has plagued us for a very, very long time. I certainly don't want to be the kutter in the room to be complaining about my job, but I want to start with something where I don't usually start with, and that is to start by saying what the international community will not do or cannot do. Every month I'm asked by the Security Council to report on what we're doing, but here today I have the liberty to actually start the opposite way. And let me start by saying very clearly that what the international community will not do is it will not give up hope and it will not give up on achieving peace between Israelis and Palestinians. It will not put its engagement with this conflict on hold. Neither will it agree that the status quo that we have today is sustainable and is going to go on forever and ever. And I don't think it is in the interest of anyone, not the people of Israel, not the people of Palestine, to actually accept the status quo as the reality of today and of tomorrow. In a situation in which you have a country like Israel, a strong country with democracy, with a strong, vibrant parliament, with a civil society that is respected around the world, with the rule of law that is acknowledged by everyone, a strong democratic country that continues to hold another people under military occupation cannot continue forever and ever, because it will inevitably undermine the democratic values of the democratic society that Israel is. It will start eroding society from the inside, and it will not allow people to flourish in the way that they really want to, both economically, culturally, morally, and in all kinds of other ways. It will also mean that Israel will continue to be ever more scrutinized by the rest of the world, particularly in Europe, America, other parts of the world as well, but particularly in Europe and America. And I think what has been demonstrated recently by the publication of what came to be known as the Quartet report is that increasingly Israel's policies in the West Bank will be scrutinized and looked at more carefully and in greater detail than ever before. We have in the United Nations an obligation to uphold international law, international principles, Security Council resolutions, and this is what, in fact, we do on a daily basis. But if we look around the world and we look to our partners in America, in the EU, in Russia, the Quartet, all four of us, we see an increased agreement and an increased understanding that it is necessary for us to look at the details of what is happening on the ground, not just at the big picture and the broad statements, but at the details of what is going on the ground and the policies that are unfolding. The second thing that the international community will not do, and let me be absolutely clear about that, is impose a solution. We cannot impose a solution. Neither should we impose a solution. No third party can decide for Israelis and Palestinians what compromises are there to make, what risks they're ready to take for peace, or how that peace will look. In fact, again, we have consistently said that A permanent status agreement that ends the conflict, and I'm quoting here, can only be achieved through direct bilateral negotiations. And this is, again, still the consensus of the international community. Now, part of that consensus is that the two-state solution indeed is the answer that we are all looking for, as difficult it is to get to that solution. There are many anniversaries this year and next year coming around, and I'm sure everybody will play politics with these anniversary, but it's been, let me add a couple of more anniversaries to the list. It's 80 years since the Peel Commission announced the two-state solution officially in what was then colonial Britain. And it's also 70 years since this two-state solution was firstly endorsed by the United Nations. And I know it's questioned by many today in public debate whether that is the right way to go forward, both here in Israel and among the Palestinians. But I see no other answer except a two-state solution to the legitimate national, historic aspirations of both peoples to have a state of their own and to live in peace and security. Now, how that is achieved, on the basis of what agreements that is achieved, and how it is implemented is a matter for negotiations, and it is a matter that stems from the legitimacy of international decisions, including Security Council resolutions. The third thing that the international community cannot do is it cannot endorse any approach that bypasses the Palestinians in achieving peace. And let me be very also clear about that, because the realities of the world today are that, yes, there is a broad interest, a strategic interest in many in the Middle East to find an avenue to peace. But that avenue to peace goes through an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians on a final status arrangements. If not that, at least the beginning of a road that everyone needs to walk together upon in order to reach that agreement. Recently, in a meeting in a rather large country in the Gulf, one of the senior leaders said to me, look, if we take all prior agreements that have been negotiated between the two sides, if we sit down, pretty much you and I can draft out the parameters of a final status agreement that would be acceptable to both sides. But neither you nor I can implement it for both sides. And that is why it is important for us in the international community to look at what we can do. And what we can do is, in fact, support both sides in reaching that agreement. Not do it for them, not implement it for them, but support them in reaching it. And support them in reaching it today means, I go back to the beginning of what I was saying earlier, support today means looking at the conditions on the ground and looking at what is happening on the ground and creating the conditions that would allow both sides in the future, when the conditions are right and the leadership is willing, to return to direct bilateral negotiations. If we push for direct bilateral negotiations today, for some we would be dreamers, for others we would be naive, but certainly we would not be realistic. What is realistic today to do is to actually look at what policies need to change as we speak by both sides in order to allow these negotiations to be meaningful and substantial and yield the results that everybody is looking for. And let me again go back to the many, many detailed discussions which we've had in the Middle East Quartet on what are these conditions and outline some ideas of what that might be. Let me start with the question of policies that need to change. And certainly the policies that need to change in Area C, and these are policies by the State of Israel, are perhaps the first issue. These policies relate to settlement construction and expansion, to preventing the development of Palestinian communities, and to the construction and sometimes legalization of what is known as illegal outposts. Changing these policies is critical. It is critical that these policies change in order to allow a process of rebuilding trust between Israelis and Palestinians, not just in the sense of the word for to create an environment for negotiations, but to create a room, in fact, on the ground, to create room for a two-state solution in the future along the parameters and lines that both sides would agree. It is very concerning that these discussions are very difficult, because in some cases that should be rather easy. Of course, obviously, everything that relates to settlement construction and expansion becomes a very highly politicized issue here in the State of Israel. But there are many, many other things that can be done on the ground to allow for the development of communities and to allow them to have a better living, better living conditions and life in general in order for them to restore a sense of hope in the future. Certainly, this is in the hands of Israel. But there are things that are in the hands of the Palestinians as well. And creating, upholding, and advancing a single and democratic Palestinian authority with strong public legitimacy and the capacity to exert its authority in the territory that it controls is very important as well. We've seen the success that the Palestinian Authority has been over the years in providing opportunities for people in the areas that they control, particularly in the West Bank, in cooperating on issues related to security with Israel. But the Palestinian Authority needs to extend its ability to control not just what it has in the West Bank, but also the Gaza Strip. And I get to the third question, which is also very, very critical. A dramatic change in the situation in Gaza is necessary. A dramatic change in the political, humanitarian, economic, and finally, and most importantly, security environment in Gaza needs to change. I manage to get out to Gaza at least once a month, and often I see different people there, not just government leaders and NGOs. On one of my recent trips, I went to visit a school and met with school children. And these children were part of a debating club that was simulating a parliament with government and opposition and all of it. It was very exciting to see them actually do it and to really get worked up about the political debates that they had. But it was also extremely sad to know that most likely that experience will just remain a mock parliament for them, because they have no recourse to such a political democratic establishment in the environment that they are growing up in Gaza. But even worse for these children is the fact that as they grow up, they have practically no opportunities. They go to school, they may go to university, they will have no jobs, they will have no opportunities for personal development. And they will unfortunately become easy prey for radicals and extremists. And this is why it's very important, we believe, to not just talk about the need to change the situation in Gaza, but to work to restore the unity of the Palestinian Authority's control over the territories in the West Bank and in Gaza as well. That means many issues, many questions that need to be addressed internally in the Palestinian political establishment related to reconciliation and to unity. But even if all of this was done, even if Israel were to change substantial parts of its policies in the West Bank, if the Palestinian leadership were to strengthen its authority and control over Gaza, that would not be enough. We need to look at very clearly two other things. And one is a zero tolerance, a policy of zero tolerance for terror and incitement. And that needs to be understood by all of us, but by everyone on both sides. Incitement is the thing that eats you up alive. It is when you allow your darkest fears to run your language, to run your actions, that you become a subject of control for these darkest fears. And that is the tragedy that we see today. We need to not just talk about incitement, we need to stand up against incitement very, very clearly and on all sides. And terrorism as well. When someone with a gun walks into a restaurant and has a political agenda and starts shooting at people, that is an act of terror. It doesn't matter if it happens in Tel Aviv, if it happens in Brussels or anywhere else. That is an act of terror. And that act of terror needs to be condemned. And that act of terror does not help bring about a Palestinian state. It does not help bring about hope or restore hope to people. Praising such acts of terror does not advance peace. And that is why we in the international community need to be very clear about these lines and make sure that, again, we don't just talk about them, but we actually work with the authorities to implement them. Because I know from personal experience, and I know both from President Abbas and from senior leaders in his team, that he and the people around him are absolutely 100% committed to peace and nonviolence. And that commitment is the core of what he stands for. And you will see that in the next months, in the next days, coming up to the Fatah conference, he will be challenged. He will be challenged by many who will be radical, who will be angry, and who will want to take his position and to take the leadership away from him. But none of them will stand with a stronger message for security and for nonviolence than he will. Of course, that doesn't mean that there is not a long list of things that the Palestinian Authority doesn't need to do in terms of addressing the questions of incitement and the questions of that plague the final point that I want to make today in this list of things that can be done on the ground, and that is the point about trust and tolerance. All trust seems to have been lost in this conflict, or practically all trust seems to have been lost in this conflict. I have not met an Israeli who has not been disappointed by the many years of what people see as missed opportunities to build peace, and the increased security threat that people have seen come after these missed opportunities, Intifada, Gaza, etc. But I have not met a Palestinian who hasn't also lost hope that there's anything at the end of this, that the final goal of what you have today is not just a continuation of the situation on the ground and the negative trends that we're seeing, but it's actually something positive. And in this environment in which trust has been lost, I hear both sides talk about not about agreement, but about separation, about walls and fences and going their different ways. And most recently, a journalist told me how even Palestinian journalists themselves don't want to talk to Israeli journalists, and these lines are, of communities are breaking up completely. And it is a dangerous time when that happens. And it is also not just a dangerous time because of the security risk, but it is strategically dangerous because Palestinians and Israelis together are destined to find a way of living on this land and sharing its resources and sharing its beauty and its history. And that is when things become more difficult. And that is why restoring trust falls pretty much to civil society organizations, to popular movements, to people who are willing to stand up and say, it doesn't matter whether you're on the right or on the left or for which party you vote, you have to have hope that peace at the end of this is possible. And this is the type of movement, this type of support that we also need to find a way of encouraging. If you leave it all to politicians and diplomats, and sadly I seem to be both, one in my country, another one here, you're not going to get anywhere. You really need to get out of this cycle of loss of hope and separation and try and restore the trust that is necessary to fight extremism, to fight radicalism, and to stand up for what is possible. And in this process, I think, finally, the international community, as much as I can speak for the international community, is a very broad term, needs to be able to address some of the spoilers in any such effort. One spoiler is this trend to deny the historic and religious link between Jews and Palestinians and their holy places in this land. And it needs to be done not just in speeches, but it perhaps needs to be done a little bit more solidly and a little bit more formidably, because the international consensus in the two-state solution must also include the understanding that both people have the right, a historic, national right, to have a state of their own. And accepting the existence of one state does not mean denying the right of the other state to exist. And this is what we, again, need to work very hard to consolidate. Secondly, we need to stand up to all those who want to allow this entire region to become prey to radicals and extremists, be they of religious or political or any other character. The Middle East is sadly in a time of transition in itself, with major geopolitical shifts happening. But as these major geopolitical shifts happening, what we're seeing is a weakening of institutions in many, many countries of the Arab world, of breakdowns of societies, and usually there is one similar theme which goes through all countries. And that is that if you take a community, whether you define it by religion or you define it by ethnicity, nationality, or anything else, if for a long enough period of time you attack this community, you break its social structure, you marginalize it, you push it in the corner, you put it in poverty, whether that's in this part of the world or further to the east or in North Africa or wherever else, if you do this long enough, this community will collapse. And this community will become prey for people with a radical, often terrorist, most often violent agenda, as we have seen in Iraq, we've seen in Syria, we've seen elsewhere in the Middle East. And this is what we need to collectively stand up against. And that is where the responsibility for both Israel, its moderate Arab neighbors, the international community, is shared. We need to stand against that rise of radicalism, strengthen the forces of moderation where we can, and work together. And to be able to get to that stage, we obviously need to address the situation as we see it here on the ground. Thank you very much for this opportunity to address this forum, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the speeches. Thank you.